Now that the Texas Longhorns are in the college football playoffs, should we see more of Arch Manning moving forward? My answer is yes, and we discuss on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by FanDuel. Get into the NFL action with FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. At most, 4 more weeks of the college football season, 4 more games for, any team in the playoffs. And I think about 4 or 5 games left in the NFL before we get to the playoffs. So football season winding down, get into FanDuel, get in on the action and try to make you some money before you have to bet on basketball and baseball. All right. On today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, Arch needs more snaps. We're in the playoffs. It's time to pull out Arch Manning a little bit more. In the second segment, the all SEC teams have been announced. Some Texas Longhorn players on the first, second, and third team well represented, and then also a couple snubs, a couple players I thought that should have been on the all SEC teams this year that balled out, that did not make it. And then the last segment, would a loss to Clemson represent a disappointing season for the Texas Longhorns? I believe so. But we discussed in the last segment all of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before I get into today's subject matter, I'm talking about Arch Manning and just needing more snaps. I have to say that Georgia fans and Oklahoma fans have become some of my favorite fan bases, right? Like, obviously, they talk a lot of trash. You know what I mean? They'll come in your mentions crazy and hot and, all of that. You know what I mean? And they're a lot to deal with when you play their teams. When you play Oklahoma, when you play Georgia, their fans are a lot to deal with. But being that we've lost to Georgia twice this year, right? And I've had so many Georgia fans in my comments just talking and watching the videos. I've had really great interactions with them. So, I think that's one of the cool parts of podcasting and, playing all of these different teams and being in the SEC now is you really get to engage with other fan bases. And, there's going to be a lot of trash talking, there's going to be a lot of, chest being poked out or whatever. But at the end of the day, there's just mutual respect there. It's just football fans enjoying the product on the field. And it's been a lot of respect from Georgia fans. It's been a lot of good conversations with Georgia fans the 2 times we played this year. And I've really appreciated those interactions. Now, enough about Georgia, right? Because I'm tired of y'all beating my damn team. So, look, Texas is now in the college football playoffs, right? You had your SEC schedule. You were in the SEC championship. It didn't go as planned. People have talked about, what Texas is. Are they good? Are they frauds? They haven't beaten a good team. They had the easiest schedule in SEC history. All of that's over, right? You win the next 4 games, you're national champions, and nobody can ever take that away from you. You are in the college football playoffs at this point. And what's right in front of you now is not an SEC team. It's Clemson from the ACC. And a lot of people feel as though that Texas somewhat now has a favorable path to at least get to the semifinals of the playoffs before it starts to get a little tough, right? Because Clemson is a 9-3 football team that won the ACC. Most people believe that, especially coming to Austin to play Texas on their home turf, that Texas should be able to win that game. The winner of Texas and Clemson, right, which we hope will be Texas, will face Arizona State in a neutral site. Even though Arizona State won the Big 12, most people would believe that Texas is the better team and Texas should be able to take care of business against Arizona State. Then that puts you in position in the semifinals to face either Oregon, Ohio State, or Tennessee, which all 3 of those teams would represent a very tough matchup. And then if you made it to the national championship game, then of course you would be facing the winner on that side of the bracket, the other side of the bracket, which a lot of people believe will be Georgia, right? And it could set up Texas, Georgia part 3. It could be Penn State. I mean, it's the playoffs, right? So it could be any team. But that is Texas' potential path to a national championship. It does seem like it starts off favorable for Texas if Texas is who we think they are. And, they play Texas Longhorns football. They should be able to take care of Clemson and Arizona State. And based on what we've seen in every game this year, outside of the 2 games against the Georgia Bulldogs, coincidentally, the 2 games against, great to elite competition on your schedule. So it's now win or go home, right? If you lose any game moving forward, you will not be hoisting that trophy at the end of the season and you will be going home, right? And so you have to pull out all the stops. And to me, when we say we have to pull out all the stops, that means we need to go to Arch Manning a little bit more. And it really has nothing to do with Quinn Ewers. Obviously, there's been so much debate amongst the Texas Longhorns fan base. Should Quinn be the guy? Should Arch Manning be the guy? It's not really about Quinn. At this point, Quinn Ewers is your starting quarterback. You brought him back in 2024 to be your starting quarterback. At most, he has 4 games left in a Texas Longhorns jersey. At most. So it's not about his ego anymore. It's not about quarterback controversy. It's really not about anything of that nature. And Quinn is still going to be your quarterback, right? But at this point, you have to do everything possible to win a national championship. You have to pull out all the stops. And Arch Manning brings a dynamic to the game that is going to be very tough for defenses to defend, right? Arch Manning is going to be very tough to account for when he's on the field. Quinn Ewers is still a very solid quarterback, right? And I believe that we can win a championship with Quinn Ewers, but it would be very neglectful of Steve Sarkisian to not use number 16 and Arch Manning and the dynamic he brings for this Texas Longhorns football team. You cannot keep a player like that on the sidelines when you were 4 games away from winning a national championship. And Arch Manning has shown the ability this year to be an elite dual threat quarterback. Right now, maybe he hasn't put it all together if you're asking him to be your starter for an entire season, but he can come into the game and make elite plays throwing the ball, right, with his arm, and make elite plays running the ball with his legs. We've seen both at various points in the season, and Sark has to be able to utilize that in the playoffs, right? So the last 2 weeks, we've seen him brought in, right, take out Quinn Ewers, spell Quinn Ewers, and bring in Arch Manning. And against A&M, 3 carries for 14 yards and a touchdown. We thought we would see it more against Georgia, and we didn't, right? Only 1 carry for 5 yards. But earlier in the season, when he was playing in more of a role because Quinn Ewers was hurt, we saw really him be dynamic at a high level. 63 rushing yards against UTSA. He had that long 67-yard touchdown run. He had 34 yards against Mississippi State, which is still really good. And then on 1 carry, he had 21 yards against the Georgia Bulldogs. So like I said, he's shown the ability to be explosive in the run game. Steve Sarkisian has to make defenses account for that. And that's just something that Quinn Ewers really can't bring to the table. That's not the type of player he is. And when you look at it, like I said, I've been talking to all these Georgia fans and Texas fans are wondering, why did we not see more of Arch Manning in the game against Georgia, right? And once again, it is not about Quinn Ewers. This is not about benching Quinn Ewers. This is about utilizing one of the most dynamic players in college football that would give defenses nightmares. Georgia this year has struggled against running quarterbacks. So why would Sark leave a running quarterback with a dynamic arm on the bench in a matchup like this against Georgia? When you look at it, Jalen Milroe, obviously Arch Manning is not Jalen Milroe, but 16 carries for 117 yards and 2 touchdowns. Jackson Dart, 8 carries for 50 yards. That is a lot, right, in a game from your quarterback. Haynes King, albeit in 8 overtimes, 24 carries for 110 yards and 3 touchdowns. And of course, Georgia Tech runs, the triple option, so it's a lot to defend. The point is that in that game against Georgia, Arch Manning could have came in with more opportunity and given Kirby Smart and that defense a lot more to defend, right? Maybe you make a lot more explosive plays on offense with him being able to run the ball, or them, kind of coming in thinking he's going to run the ball, or, hand off on the read option, and then he throws the ball over their heads. Nonetheless, you are in the playoffs right now, right? Clemson, Arizona State, then whoever, right? The point is that any defense would have a hard time having to defend what Arch Manning brings to the table. And I believe that if you want to hoist the trophy at the end of the season, you need to utilize Arch Manning as much as possible. Quinn Ewers is still your starting quarterback. Once again, this is not about benching Quinn Ewers. This is about utilizing one of the most dynamic, explosive, dual threat quarterbacks in the country in Arch Manning to help propel this offense and help propel this Texas Longhorns football team to being a national champion. A quick word from our sponsors, and then we get into, didn't mean to do that. Quick word from our sponsors, and then we get into the all SEC teams being announced. What Texas players were given their recognition and what Texas players were snubbed, in my opinion. Next. All right, today's episode of Locked On Longhorns brought to you by Omaha Steaks. Nothing delivers comfort and joy quite like the unrivaled quality and taste of Omaha Steaks. It's guaranteed perfection in every single bite, and right now you can save on unforgettable gifts with 50% off site-wide at omahasteaks.com. Plus, score an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. With 5 generations of experience, they consistently deliver the world's best steak experience, and the gifting experts at Omaha Steaks have made it easy to deliver the perfect gift with thoughtfully curated gift packages featuring gourmet favorites from legendary steaks to mouth-watering desserts and more. Save 50% off site-wide for a limited time at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our listeners get an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. That's 50% off at omahasteaks.com, OMAHA steaks.com, and an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. Minimum purchase may apply. All right, talking about the all SEC teams, they were announced on Tuesday, so we're discussing them on Wednesday's episode of Locked On Longhorns. Once again, Texas Longhorns well represented. Not as many players that were on the preseason all SEC team, but still, you know, one of the best teams in the SEC made it to the SEC championship, so of course you're going to have some players on there. And then, like I said, some players I felt were snubbed, right? I got one on offense and one on defense. We're going to start with Kelvin Banks, obviously. You know, one of the best players in the country, should be a top 10 draft pick, depending on where my Cowboys land. I've been saying that I think the Cowboys should go after Kelvin Banks in the first round, right? We haven't had great tackle play. Tyler Guyton necessarily hasn't worked out. I know this isn't Locked On Cowboys, but just give me a second. Tyler Guyton necessarily hasn't worked out at left tackle. Terrence Steele hasn't been great since they gave him that big deal. And I think, you know, just to be a great offense, you need elite tackle play, right? You need a tackle you can rely on. Kelvin Banks, one of the best pass blockers we've seen in college football the last 3 years. So hopefully he can stay in the state of Texas. But first team, Kelvin Banks Jr. at the tackle position, 85.4 overall grade this season from Pro Football Focus, 89.6 pass blocking grade this season from Pro Football Focus. Just elite on that left side. And you've really seen, you know, kind of the impact of him not being there. We were able to still take care of business in the Texas A&M game, albeit only scoring 17 points. And then in the Georgia game, right, Trevor Gooseby, you know, baptism by fire, right? He was able to come in and perform well against Texas A&M. Georgia, Michael Williams, a different beast. You really missed your, you know, all American, just all world left tackle in Kelvin Banks on 725 snaps this season. 725 snaps, only 6 pressures and 1 sack allowed. That's not all pass blocking snaps, of course, but still 6 pressures and 1 sack allowed on 725 snaps this year. Kelvin Banks has proven to be one of the best players in the country since he stepped on campus 3 years ago. And it's a shame that he has, you know, at most 4 games left, because he'll definitely be in the National Football League next year. But certainly a first team all SEC type of performance this year from Kelvin Banks, and he should be an All-American as well. Texas had one more first team all SEC player, and I think it's well deserved, Jahdae Barron, right? After being, which is hilarious, right? After being honorable mention, I believe, the last couple of years in the Big 12, his first year in the SEC, which he came back to college to elevate his draft stock and show he could play a little bit more on the outside. He's first team all SEC, right? And just well deserved. Such a playmaker for the Longhorns this year. After having one of the worst pass defenses in the country last year, they come back and have a historic pass defense this year. They elevated the safety play, but also one of the biggest reasons is you were able to bring Jahdae Barron back, and he had an All-American type season. So first team all SEC. This brother took snaps on the defensive line this year, in the box, slot corner, wide corner, and free safety. So just such a chess piece for Pete Kwiatkowski in this defense this season. 90.3 defensive grade according to Pro Football Focus, 90.9 coverage grade according to Pro Football Focus. I pay $26 a month for it, so y'all gonna get these numbers. You know what I'm saying? I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at y'all. They cost me $26 a month, so y'all gonna get them, right? 38 tackles, 5 interceptions, 1 sack. Was targeted 52 times this year. Only allowed 29 catches for 237 yards and 0 touchdowns. So like I said, Jahdae Barron, first team all SEC type season, All-American type season, one of the best defenders in college football this season, and certainly brought so much to this Texas defense. And that's just tangibly, right? In terms of intangible, just the leadership, the experience, just kind of being a calming presence in the locker room, being somebody who's been there, done that in championship games, in the playoffs. Really grateful that Jahdae Barron came back for another season. Quinn Ewers was the second team all SEC quarterback. I was surprised by this. I thought it would be Jalen Milroe, right? Even though Quinn Ewers, even with missing games, had better passing stats than Jalen Milroe and had more touchdowns. Jalen Milroe had 20 rushing touchdowns, right? So, like, overall, he had like 35 touchdowns compared to Quinn Ewers with 25. I didn't write down any rushing touchdowns he had, but he didn't have, 35 total touchdowns. So I was surprised that he got second, all SEC second team over Jalen Milroe. And this is not me ragging on Quinn Ewers, right? I thought Quinn Ewers definitely had a solid season, but I did think Jalen Milroe was the second best quarterback, even with the 3 losses. I thought Jalen Milroe was the second best quarterback in the SEC this year. But look, they can't take it away from Quinn, right? Second team all SEC, 2,665 passing yards, 25 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, 66.2 completion percentage, 148.1 rating out of 200, 71.7 passing grade from Pro Football Focus. Is it the season we expected from Quinn Ewers? Probably not, but still overall a very solid season. Led this team to 11-2. I guess you can say maybe 9-2, right? Because he missed a couple games, got injured against UTSA. Nonetheless, right? Wasn't a perfect season from Quinn Ewers. Maybe didn't elevate his draft stock the way we thought he would. Maybe wasn't the Heisman contender we thought Quinn would be, but still a very solid season from your signal caller at the University of Texas and Quinn Ewers, second team all SEC. Gunnar Helm, second team all SEC. This one was weird to me, right? I just kind of assumed that Gunnar Helm would be labeled as the best tight end in the SEC, but they gave it to Eli Stowers from Vanderbilt, right? Now, Gunnar Helm did play one more game than Eli Stowers played, but he had more catches, more yards, and more touchdowns than Eli Stowers. So what is the argument for Eli Stowers being the first team SEC tight end over Gunnar Helm, who was second team? Now, am I splitting hairs, right? Am I nitpicking? He's still all SEC, right? But, these players are playing for pride, right? They're prideful players. He deserved first team SEC. I mean, more catches, more yards, more touchdowns. What are they going off, run blocking grade? You know what I'm saying? Like, I know they're not doing that. I know they don't care that much. So very surprising to see Gunnar Helm second team and not first team. 49 catches this year, 611 yards and 5 touchdowns, 68.2 receiving grade for Gunnar Helm. Such a big part of what we do in the passing game and the rushing game, being a run blocker on that offensive line or being an extension of that offensive line, especially with a lot of 12 personnel that we run at the University of Texas. So Gunnar Helm thought he should have been the first team, but nonetheless was recognized, as he should be, as an all-SEC tight end. Anthony Hill, right, second team. You could probably make the argument that he was first team because he was a baller this year. I've said at some point he's going to be the SEC Defensive Player of the Year. He's probably going to have to do it next year. He definitely won't be on the 40 acres for 4 years, but just an elite player at that linebacker position that can do a little bit of everything. 90 tackles, 7.5 sacks, 4 forced fumbles, 1 interception, over 15 tackles for loss this season, 84.5 overall defensive grade. Anthony Hill was elite this year at the quarterback, as the quarterback of the Texas defense. One of the biggest reasons why the Texas defense was arguably the best defensive unit in the country this season, right? Anthony Hill, just an amazing player. So grateful that we were able to flip him from Texas A&M and get him in that burnt orange and white. And then Trey Wisner, right? We're now on to the third team, all SEC. Trey Wisner, who we probably thought would get less than 50 carries this year. Third team all SEC. They can never take that away from Trey Wisner. So happy for him. I mean, just talk about next man up. I know it's cliche. Trey Wisner has proved that next man up is a real philosophy, right? Going from, like I said, probably being a special teams guy and a guy that got carries at the end of games to being one of the best running backs in the country this year. Truly next man up mentality. You always have to be ready for your opportunity. 1,092 total yards and 4 touchdowns this season. I was surprised he only had 4 touchdowns. It felt like more than that, but nonetheless, still a really good season. Third team all SEC running back, Quintravian Wisner, right? His mama named him Quintravian. At least once I'm going to call him Quintravian. And then Andrew Makuba, third team on the defensive side, right? One of the biggest reasons we had that great pass defense is we finally got elite play from our safeties. Michael Taft and Andrew Makuba were absolutely exceptional this year. So Andrew Makuba, 42 tackles, 4 interceptions, and a forced fumble this season, 89.7 defensive and coverage grade. That's elite, ladies and gentlemen. Really good play coming over from Clemson back in his hometown in Austin, Texas. My two snubs, right? Those are all the players that made first, second, and third team. My two snubs, Jake Majors on offense and Michael Taft on defense, right? You cannot convince me there were three centers in the SEC this year better than Jake Majors. Jake Majors, 73.5 overall grade, 84.7 pass blocking grade, according to Pro Football Focus, 0 sacks allowed this season. Based on what Texas did as a team and what Jake Majors did individually, there were not three centers better than him in the SEC this year. I'm calling BS on that one. And then Michael Taft. I mean, this is egregious. 38 tackles, 2 sacks, 2 picks, a forced fumble, 91 defense and coverage grade for the season. 91 defense and coverage grade, according to Pro Football Focus for the season. Did not make first, second, or third all SEC team. That is egregious for Michael Taft. He's been one of the best players in the country on one of the best pass defenses of all time, and did not make first, second, or third team all SEC. Michael Taft continues to be disrespected, and that was like the disrespect Jahdae Barron was getting in the Big 12. They just did that to Michael Taft, and it might, motivate him to be even better in this playoff run. So that's our all SEC representatives for the Texas Longhorns in their first year in the conference. A quick word from our sponsors, and then if Texas does not beat Clemson, what that would mean for this season for the Texas Longhorns. All right, today's episode of Locked On Longhorns also brought to you by FanDuel. Once again, get into the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the National Football League all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. So that's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. All right, so the question is, would a loss to Clemson be a disappointing season for the Texas Longhorns? Yes. I know that Texas, in their first year in the SEC, went 11-1 in the regular season. I know in Texas' first year in the SEC, they made it to the SEC championship. I know in Texas' first year in the SEC, they've made it to the college football playoffs, although it doesn't mean as much because it's 12 teams now and not 4. Texas, over the course of the season, regardless of how you feel about their schedule or their quality wins, has proven that they are one of the best teams in the country. Defensively all season and for the most part on offense. I understand that. But if this Texas football team does not win a playoff game at home against a 9-3 Clemson team, or 10-3 Clemson team at this point, this season would still be a disappointment for the Texas Longhorns. I understand that Michigan was ranked at the time you played them, but we knew very early on and found out that Michigan was not a good football team, whether they beat Ohio State or not. Ohio State was ranked when you played them. We knew, not Ohio State, Oklahoma. Oklahoma was ranked when you played them. We knew Oklahoma was trash very early on, even though they beat Alabama. Vanderbilt was ranked when you played them. Vanderbilt was nothing more than a decent football team with a great win against Alabama. Texas A&M was ranked when you played them. And yet, we found out what we already knew, that Texas A&M was an above average 8-4 football team, as always. You had 2 chances against some of the better competition in college football to prove that Texas belonged in that conversation with the elites against Georgia, at home and in the SEC championship on a neutral site in Atlanta. Either way, in both of those opportunities, you lost those games. Your best win this season is against that 8-4 Texas A&M team. As good as Texas has proven themselves to be, if you do not beat this 9-3 or 10-3 Clemson team at home in the first round of the playoffs, if you go home this season without a signature win, if you go home this season 0-3 against great competition on your schedule, then yes, this will be a disappointing season for the Texas Longhorns, regardless of what you did in your conference slate, regardless of what you did in your first year in the SEC making the championship game, regardless of making the playoffs. If you do not beat Clemson on December 21st, this season will be a disappointment for the Texas Longhorns. And we'll be looking at Steve Sarkisian, Quinn Ewers, and some of the other guys on this team and asking what if for a very long time, right? What happened in the regular season and in the SEC championship game, that's over now. Texas has a fresh slate. But if you do not beat Clemson, this absolutely will be a what if type of season, because Texas and the talent on this team and what they had going into this bracket should have been able to accomplish so much more. They need to beat Clemson next Saturday and go on a run in the playoffs for me to believe that this was a positive or a great season for the Texas Longhorns. What they've done the past 13 games does not matter now. If they do not beat Clemson, this was a disappointing season, period, point blank. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay? Peace.